Thank you. Thanks again for having me. And thanks very much for your words and phrases. Many of them resonated with me as well. During my first reflection at the beginning of Lent, I spoke about the great floodwaters in the book of Genesis, the rainbow that appeared after the flood, and the covenant that God makes with Noah and all of creation. Today, I'm speaking about water again, this time with Jesus calming the storm waters. And I love to reflect on water, and it's even fitting since my last name is Waters. And water features significantly in today's reading, and so today I'm happy to share some of my thoughts on this short and powerful story of Jesus calming the storm. Just before today's reading, Jesus was teaching crowds using parables to explain how his followers could foster the kingdom of God on earth. Jesus offers his closest disciples private instruction so that they understand his parables and can teach others. After the lesson, the group leaves the crowd and take a boat across the Sea of Galilee. And while in the boat, they encounter the tumultuous storm, with great wind arising and creating waves, compromising the boat and endangering the group's survival. During all of this, Jesus apparently is asleep, which frustrates his followers. The image of God sleeping appears in some of the Psalms of the Old Testament, especially during moments of distress. Sometimes divine sleeping is mentioned to say that God doesn't sleep, but instead acts when people are in need. For example, in Psalm 121, the psalmist reflects on God's protection, saying that God will not slumber and will not sleep, but will keep Israel safe. Other times, however, divine sleeping is referenced when people cry out for help. In Psalm 44, a community offers a lament when they are suffering and facing an attack. And they implore God, saying, "Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake. Do not cast us off forever." When the disciples see Jesus sleeping, their attitude echoes that Psalm 44, wondering aloud about Jesus' posture and apparent inattention. They wake Jesus and ask, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" The question of the disciples shows their angst as they interpret Jesus sleeping as a lack of regard for their safety. Matthew and Luke's account of this incident soften the potential harshness of the question. Matthew adjusts the tone, and the disciples don't question Jesus at all, but instead they only plead for help. They say, "Lord, save us, we are perishing," not, "Don't you care that we are perishing?" Luke similarly eliminates the question, but depicts the disciples exclaiming, "Master, Master, we are perishing." Mark's account conveys the high level of anxiety, fear, and frustration that the disciples felt in the moment. Jesus does not verbally address their question, but he critiques them for it at the end of the story. To respond to their question, Jesus acts. He demonstrates care by manifesting power to save the group. He rebukes the wind and sea, saying, "Peace, be still," to which the wind and sea respond by immediately calming down. The way that Jesus calms the water shares parallels with his first healing story in Mark. Early in his ministry, Jesus encountered a man with an unclean spirit, and he rebuked the spirit and told it to be silent and to leave, just as he rebukes the wind and sea, and they are immediately calm. These demonstrations of power and control of seemingly uncontrollable elements like the environment or like spirits, these are integral parts of Jesus' teaching ministry. They're acts that communicate his abilities and his interest in caring for the needs of his community. And these acts garnered followers. As the gospel writers record their accounts of Jesus' ministry for later communities, these wondrous acts were informative and compelling ways to understand Jesus' significance and to understand his mission. Because the storm waters and the wind are such powerful and relatable images, these elements are present in other biblical texts, often used to encourage human and divine responses. I'm going to highlight two short passages that I think are useful for reflecting on Mark's gospel. I'm going to briefly share my screen so you can see a couple of texts. All right, so here's an excerpt from the book of Jonah. This is from Jonah chapter 1. In the story, the prophet is called to deliver a prophecy, but he runs away from the job. He's supposed to head east to the city of Nineveh, but instead he boards a ship heading due west to Tarshish. In response, God sends a great wind upon the sea, creating a mighty storm similar to the image we hear in Mark's gospel. And here's the quote: "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. The captain came and said to him, 'What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish.'" In this chapter, God manipulates the wind and the seas to show anger at Jonah fleeing from his prophetic calling. The storm is a manifestation of God's power to control the natural world, and it also serves to increase the faith of the mariners who are on board the ship. When the storm hits, the first thing they do is to show acts of devotion to their individual gods, offering prayers for relief. Jonah, on the other hand, goes to sleep. Similar to Jesus' disciples, Jonah's companions question why he sleeps through the tumultuous storm. As the exchange continues after these verses, Jonah informs them that he is, in fact, the cause of the storm. So he understands it. He recognizes the storm as God's response to his failure to follow instructions. And he tells the group to throw him into the sea in order to quiet it down. Here, as the story continues, they cried out to the Lord, "Please, O Lord, we pray," this is the mariners, "do not let us perish on account of this man's life." So they picked Jonah up and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. The mariners, who initially believed and prayed to other gods, developed faith in the God of Israel because of their experience in the storm. When they see God's ability to calm the storm, they become even more faithful and make explicit gestures to show their devotion, such as offering sacrifices and vows. They no longer pray to their gods, but to the Lord. And notably, the mariners are said to fear the Lord. Fear of the Lord is often interpreted as a sign of deep respect of God's power, not being afraid, but rather being respectful and in awe of God's abilities. Unlike the fear of the Lord, being afraid, as the disciples were in Mark, is something that is often critiqued or at least seen as a sign of a lack of faith in God's saving power. So fear of the Lord is good, but being afraid can be bad. As for the storm in the Jonah story, it's a central character whose behavior reflects God's reactions to events. The tumultuousness and the calming of the storm are viewed as God's reactions to Jonah. Moreover, experiencing the extreme changes of the sea enables the mariners, and ultimately, as the story continues, Jonah, to increase their faith in God. Another biblical passage that has echoes of today's reading is Psalm 107. And here are a few verses from that. The psalm focuses on divine deliverance and it offers thanksgiving, especially during difficult experiences in life. The psalmist begins with a call to give thanks to God. "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." Then there are various people groups who are experiencing hardships in life that are highlighted, and that they're highlighted in the ways that God helps them. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to an inhabited town. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. And the psalm continues. Other groups highlighted some sat in darkness and in gloom. prisoners in misery and in irons. Some were sick through their sinful way. Each of these groups is often isolated within a society, and they may fear for their survival. And each of the groups calls on God for some kind of relief. And the refrain repeats throughout the psalm, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and the Lord delivers and saves them from their pain. The last group mentioned in verses 23 and through 30 are those who experience a storm. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. As in Mark, in this psalm, the experience of the storm compels people to cry out for divine assistance. And asking for help is a sign of them having faith that God can deliver. And the divine response is to quiet the waves and the storms. And this deliverance is why the group sing praise and thanksgiving for God. So to get back to the story in Mark, the ending of the story, their sort of reaction to the storm and Jesus's powers, helps to explain what the storm experience was trying to achieve. And it also reflects recurring shortcomings of the disciples, their lack of faith and their lack of understanding. After Jesus rebukes the storm, he addresses their question, "Don't you care that we are perishing?" Jesus reprimands his followers, asking why were they afraid and why do they still lack faith? The storm experience was meant to be instructive so that Jesus' inner circle of followers could show their belief and trust in God and their understanding of Jesus' saving power. But they don't do that, at least not in Mark. And this might have influenced Matthew and Luke to tweak their question to make it more of an exclamation, which at least gives a bit better response to the storm. After Jesus saves them, the disciples are filled with great awe, which is perhaps the reverence and the fear of the Lord that was desired. And yet they also show their lack of understanding again, questioning, who is this who even the wind and sea obey? The issue of faith and understanding are essential to the gospel, and Jesus is constantly working to instill and increase both in his followers. His closest followers sometimes show the most room for growth, and sometimes it's the nameless people in the crowds who demonstrate the faith and understanding that Jesus wants to see in all of his followers. Next Sunday's gospel will build on this importance of faith. The reading will focus on Jesus healing a woman and a young girl, and both of those healings are on account of their faith, or on account of faith. The woman is healed by her faith in Jesus's power, and the girl is healed by the faith of her parents. The story of Jesus and the disciples in the storm sets up the issue of the faith or lack of faith. And next week, we'll see a more effective and expected demonstration of faith and understanding, especially during difficult circumstances. As we enter our small groups, it might be helpful to think about how the disciples and Jesus responded to the storm and how we respond to difficult moments. What do we do when we're having a tough time or facing a metaphorical storm? Do we call out for help from God? Or do we recognize divine saving power when it's happening? Or do we cry out in frustration and question why God sleeps? If you're like me, you probably do some combination of both. Maybe sometimes more like those disciples, more on the frustration side of things. But it's important to reflect on how we react to these difficult moments. And beyond that, the story also invites us to reflect on the various storms that are impacting the world and our responses to them. If Jesus is our model for how to live, then how do we rebuke and calm the storms of our world? What can we do to bring about the peace and stillness that Jesus is able to achieve in the story? I hope these questions and this commentary have given you some good food for thought. Thanks for having me.